humanity walked away from the Galactic Council. Only then did the galaxy understand their worth. The vote was already over before I sat down. I knew at the moment I walked into the Grand Convocation Hall and saw the way High Arbiter Zavaz of the Veth Hegemony leaned back in his seat. That slow, comfortable lean of a man who has already won. He did not look at me. None of them did. 1,012 species seated in that chamber, and not a single pair of eyes turned toward the human delegation. My name is Sarah Voss. I have been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 11 years. I have sat in this hall through trade disputes, through border crises, through the slow and painful rewriting of interstellar law. I have shaken hands, or claws, or tendrils, or whatever the local equivalent happened to be, with representatives from every corner of this galaxy. I have eaten food I could not identify, spoken languages that made my jaw ache for days, and smiled through 1,000 conversations where I could see, plainly, that the person across from me was simply waiting for me to stop talking. I have never once caused a scene. Today was not going to be any different, at least, not in the way they expected. The Kareth Accords had been in development for 3 years. On the surface, they looked like progress. A sweeping agreement to bind council member species into a unified economic and military framework. Shared resources, shared defense, shared infrastructure funding. The language was elegant. The council's public relations wing had released it in 47 languages, and every version used words like equity and partnership and collective prosperity. What the Accords actually did was lock the smaller, newer member species into a tiered system where the 6 major powers, the Veth Hegemony, the Drain Collective, the Cathali Union, and 3 others, controlled the resource allocation committees. Every vote on trade, on colonization rights, on technology sharing would flow through those committees. And those committees had been carefully structured so that no coalition of smaller species could ever outvote them. Humanity had submitted 3 formal objections over 18 months. All 3 had been tabled. The word tabled in Galactic Council procedure is a polite way of saying buried. Our requests for fair representations on the allocation committees had been heard, acknowledged, recorded in the official minutes, and ignored. Today was the final vote. I sat at the human delegation's bench, a long curved seat near the outer ring, where the newer members were placed, far from the central dais where Zavas and his colleagues held court. My aide, a 26-year-old man named Owen Cole, sat to my left with a data pad on his knee. He was new enough to this job that he still believed preparation mattered. I had stopped preparing for this vote 2 weeks ago, not because I had given up, but because I had received a different set of instructions entirely. The encrypted message from Earth's Parliament had arrived at 3 a.m, Nairobi time. I had read it 4 times, then I had gotten up, made tea, and read it again. Article 7. The clause that had existed in Earth's Galactic Council membership charter since the beginning, quietly included by the legal team that negotiated our original entry. It allowed for formal withdrawal from the Council under conditions of sustained procedural discrimination. It had never been used. It had never needed to be used, because no one had ever thought Earth would actually use it. 40 years of membership. 40 years of showing up, contributing, building, fixing, translating, mediating, inventing, and being quietly essential. And now Parliament had looked at those 40 years and the 3 tabled objections and the polished language of the Kareth Accords and decided that enough was enough. The vote proceeded exactly as expected. The Accords passed with 891 votes in favor. The human delegation voted against. 17 other smaller species voted against. The result was recorded. Zavaz allowed himself a small smile. Then the floor opened for formal statements. Most delegations passed. A few offered brief congratulations. Zavaz gave a short speech about galactic unity that I did not listen to because I was reading the withdrawal declaration on my datapad for the last time, making sure I had memorized every word. When it was the human delegation's turn, I stood. The hall did not quiet immediately. There was still the low hum of side conversations, the rustle of delegates settling in, the soft tones of translation units adjusting frequencies. I waited. I had learned, over 11 years, that silence is a tool. You use it the way a carpenter uses a level, to show what is crooked. After a moment, the hall quieted. I would like to make a formal statement on behalf of the human delegation, I said. My voice was even. I had practiced this in my hotel room the night before, not to rehearse the emotions out of it, but to make sure there was none to begin with. Pursuant to Article 7 of Earth's original membership charter, and in accordance with the provisions outlined in subsections 3 through 9 of that article, the sovereign world of Earth hereby formally withdraws its membership from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. Owen did not move beside me. To his credit, he had known this was coming. I had told him the night before. He had not slept, I suspected, but he was holding himself together with both hands. The hall did not erupt. That surprised some people later when they wrote about that day. They expected chaos, shouting, some dramatic response. Instead, there was a silence so complete and so sudden that I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I had more words prepared, a full accounting of our objections, a clear statement of why this decision had been made. I had written and rewritten that section a dozen times. I chose not to use it. Some things do not need explanation. The explanation only gives the other side something to argue with, something to pick apart and reframe and use against you. When the answer is simply no, the wisest thing you can do is say it clearly and then stop talking. I set the data pad on the bench. I gathered my materials. I gestured to Owen, who rose without a word. Together we walked toward the exit. The hall was still silent. 1,012 species and not one voice. Zavaz spoke when I was nearly at the door. His voice carried easily across the chamber. He had a gift for projection, I had always noticed. Ambassador Voss, he said. The tone was almost amused. Surely you understand that this changes nothing. Earth will find its way back once the gesture has been made. I stopped walking. I turned slowly and looked at him across the length of that enormous chamber. The distance between us was maybe 200 meters, but it felt much larger than that. I thought about all the things I could have said. There were many good ones. There was one in particular that had been living in my head for about 3 years, sharp and clear and ready. Instead, I simply looked at him for 3 seconds. Long enough to be deliberate. Then I turned back to the door and kept walking. Owen waited until we were in the corridor, out of earshot, before he spoke. Was that the right call? He asked quietly. Yes, I said. He's going to spin this as a tantrum. A bluff. I know. And we're just going to let him? I pushed the corridor door open and looked out at the pale amber sky of Vareth Prime, at the transit lines running between the towers, at the whole humming machinery of a galaxy that had never once thought to ask what we were quietly doing to keep it running. Owen, I said, some lessons cannot be taught. They can only be experienced. He did not answer. He did not need to. I had served this council for 11 years. I had given it 11 years of patience and preparation and careful work. And now I was done, not angry, not broken, not afraid, just done. I stepped into the sunlight and the door closed behind me and I did not look back. That was the day humanity left the Galactic Council. No threats, no spectacle, no last desperate plea for reconsideration. Just a door, closing quietly, in a hall full of people who had never thought to wonder what was on the other side. They would wonder soon. 6 days after I came home, the first call came. It was not from Zavaz. It was not from any of the 6 major powers. It came from a mid-level administrator in the Drain Collective's public health office. A woman named Kira Melthos, not human, but she had worked alongside human health workers for years and spoke passable English. She reached our foreign office through a back channel, quietly, the way people reach out when they need something they are embarrassed to need. There was a problem with the synthesis protocol for drain fever presence. I was sitting in my apartment in Nairobi when Deputy Minister Alan Holt called to brief me. The city was loud outside my window, the usual afternoon noise of a place that had been busy for centuries and intended to keep going. I listened to Alan's summary with a cup of tea in my hand and a feeling in my chest that I had been expecting and was still not comfortable with. The Drain Fever Suppressant Protocol, the one used to manage outbreaks across the Drain Collective's 43 inhabited systems, had been developed 12 years ago by a joint team of human and Drain xenobiologists. The core synthesis method, the part that made the suppressant work in approximately 81% of known Drain physiological types, had been developed primarily by a human researcher named Dr. Lena Marsh, working out of a university lab in Edinburgh. Dr. Marsh had published the initial findings. The Drain Collective had licensed the protocol and scaled it up for mass production. That license agreement had been structured as a bilateral treaty between Earth and the Drain Collective, meaning it was maintained and renewed through Galactic Council membership infrastructure. When Earth withdrew from the Council, the treaty framework that governed that license went into a legal gray zone. The protocol did not disappear. The knowledge still existed, but the Drain Collective's right to manufacture the suppressant at scale, under the existing terms, was now uncertain, and the Drain fever season was beginning in 8 of their systems. What are they asking? I said. They are asking if Dr. Marsh would be willing to consult on a private basis, Alan said carefully, and whether Earth might consider a bilateral arrangement outside the Council framework. Tell them we will think about it, I said. They seem fairly urgent. I'm sure they do. Alan was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, good at his job, and he had worked in the foreign ministry long enough to read between lines. Sarah, he said, this is the first one, isn't it? Yes, I said. It's the first one. I finished my tea and set the cup down and looked out the window at the city going about its afternoon. Somewhere above all that blue sky, the Galactic Council was meeting without us for the first time in 40 years. Zovaz was probably giving speeches. The 6 major powers were probably congratulating themselves on how smoothly the transition had gone. I wondered how long it would take before the next call came. It took 4 days. This one was about navigation. Owen, now working out of our Foreign Office's new outreach division, which had been quietly established the week before I came home, sent me the briefing at 6:30 in the morning. I read it over breakfast. The hyperspace navigation grid that served the Council's core shipping lanes was one of the most complex pieces of shared infrastructure in the known galaxy. It had been built over decades by contributions from dozens of species, but the real-time maintenance layer, the software that constantly calculated route drift, corrected for gravitational fluctuations, and pushed updates to every registered ship in the network, had been maintained for the last 9 years by a cooperative of human engineers based in Cape Town. They were called the Meridian Group. 14 people. 14 people and a server farm and a level of institutional knowledge about the navigation grid that no one had ever thought to document properly. Because why would you document something that was working perfectly and had been working perfectly for 9 years and showed no signs of stopping? The Meridian Group had followed Earth's withdrawal with complete professionalism. On the day Article 7 was invoked, they had filed notice with the Council's infrastructure office that their maintenance contract, being a Council-administered agreement, was now suspended pending renegotiation. They had handed over a full status report of the current grid condition and walked out. 3 weeks later, a freighter called the Varath's Promise had dropped out of hyperspace in the wrong system. Not by much, a few light hours off its calculated exit point. But the reason it dropped out wrong was that the route it had been following had drifted, and no one had corrected for it, because no one was maintaining the correction algorithms. 2 more ships went wrong in the following week. One of them, carrying agricultural machinery to a Cathali colony, ended up 3 full days off course. The Council's infrastructure office put out an emergency tender for new maintenance contractors. 14 species responded. None of them had experience with the specific architecture the Meridian Group had built. The learning curve the preliminary assessment suggested was somewhere between 8 and 18 months. In the meantime, every major shipping route through the Council's core systems was operating with a slowly growing margin of error. They haven't officially asked us anything, Owen noted when we spoke about it. They haven't asked us for help. They don't know how to ask, I said. They've never had to ask before. So what do? We wait, I said. And we make sure our own ships are updated. He paused. That seems cold. Owen, I said, we submitted 3 formal objections over 18 months. We raised this issue through every available legal and diplomatic channel. We were told repeatedly that our concerns were noted and would be considered, and then they were not considered. They were buried, and now here we are. I leaned back in my chair. Waiting is not cold. Waiting is honest. We are not their emergency repair crew anymore. We are a sovereign world that they chose to ignore. That has consequences. He was quiet for a moment. What if someone gets hurt? What if a ship doesn't just go off course? What if it goes badly off course? That one sat with me. It sat with me for a while. The Council has engineers, I said finally. They have resources. This is not an insurmountable problem. It is an expensive, time-consuming, embarrassing problem. But it is not insurmountable. The danger window is manageable if they act quickly. And if they don't act quickly, then they will learn an important lesson about what happens when you act slowly. The third crisis came from a direction I had not fully anticipated, and it was the one that finally made Zovaz stop smiling. On a Cathali agricultural colony called Vareth's Reach, about 40,000 inhabitants, a modest settlement built to supply grain to 3 nearby systems, the atmospheric processors went offline. Atmospheric processors on a colony world are not dramatic pieces of equipment. They hum in the background. They regulate the oxygen content of the enclosed habitation zones, filter out particulates, maintain pressure. When they work, no one thinks about them. When they fail, you have about 72 hours before the air inside the habitation zones starts to become a serious problem. The repair team on Vareth's Reach opened the maintenance manual. The manual existed in 2 versions. The original, which had been written and last updated by a human engineering team from Bristol, and a translated version in the Cathali language, which had been produced 6 years earlier and had never been updated to reflect a significant firmware revision. The translated version was missing a critical section. Not a minor section, the section that covered emergency restart procedures for the atmospheric control unit's core module. No one on Vareth's Reach could read English. When Owen briefed me on this, I sat very still for a long time. How bad is it? I asked. They've evacuated the outer zones. The central habitation is still stable but losing efficiency. They have maybe 60 hours if the processor doesn't come back online. He paused. 40,000 people, Sarah, so. I know. We could send the manual section. We could send a technician. It would take 2 hours to resolve. I know. He was waiting. He was very carefully not telling me what to do, but he was waiting. And his face was saying all the things he was too professional to say aloud. Send it, I said. Send the manual section and offer a remote consultation. No strings, no conditions. Make it clear that this is a humanitarian action, extended voluntarily by the Earth government, and that it does not constitute any resumption of council relations or any waiver of our withdrawal status. Owen let out a breath. Understood. And Owen, make sure the council's infrastructure office knows we sent it, not to gloat. Just so it's on the record. Right. After he left, I sat alone in my office for a while. Outside, Nairobi was doing what Nairobi always did, which was keep going with tremendous energy and very little concern for what was happening in the rest of the galaxy. I thought about the 40,000 people on Vareth's Reach, none of whom had voted on the Karath Accords, none of whom had laughed at us in the convocation hall, none of whom had anything to do with any of this. And I thought about the difference between holding a position and holding a grudge. The two things can look similar from the outside, but they are not the same. We had walked away from the council because we had been treated as less than what we were. That was a position. It was right. It was justified. But letting civilians suffer to prove a point, that was not a position. That was cruelty. Humanity had never been cruel. Not in our best moment. And I intended for this to be one of our best moments. The repair team on Vareth's Reach had the processors back online within 3 hours. No one was hurt. The crisis was resolved quietly. A formal acknowledgement arrived from the Cathali Union 12 hours later. It was brief, careful, and slightly awkward. The tone of someone who is grateful and embarrassed about being grateful, and not entirely sure what the proper protocol is for saying thank you to a species you have spent years overlooking. I read it twice, then filed it. More calls were coming. I could feel them building on the horizon like weather. And Zovas, I was certain, had stopped leaning back in his chair. He was sitting up straight now, learning at last to count. The call did not come through official channels. That was the first sign that things had truly changed. When Zavaz of the Veth hegemony wanted to speak to the human government 8 months after our withdrawal, he did not send a diplomatic notification through the council registry. He did not file a formal request with our foreign ministry. He sent a personal message to Alan Holt's private contact address, a channel normally reserved for quiet conversations between old colleagues, asking if Ambassador Voss might be available for an informal discussion. Alan forwarded it to me with a single line of his own, "Your call." I thought about it for 1 day. Then I wrote back and said I was available, but that the meeting would take place on Titan Station, in a room of our choosing, and that I would bring my own support staff. They agreed immediately. That told me everything. Titan Station was a midpoint facility, part research outpost, part transit hub, built by a consortium of 6 species and managed jointly. It was nobody's home territory, which is exactly why I chose it. Meeting on Vareth Prime, the council's seat, would have been walking into their frame. Meeting on Earth would have felt theatrical. Titan Station was neutral in the way a blank piece of paper is neutral. Whatever got written on it would define the conversation. The room they gave us was plain. Long table, muted lighting, chairs that were human-sized because they had asked in advance what we needed. That was new. They had never asked before. I arrived 20 minutes early with Owen and 2 colleagues from the foreign ministry, a man named Grant Ellison, who handled trade law, and a woman named Carla Drew, who specialized in interstellar infrastructure agreements. We set up our materials, reviewed our documentation, and said very little to each other, because we had already said everything that needed to be said. Zovaz arrived exactly on time. He had 2 aides with him, both Veth, both younger than him, both wearing the kind of carefully composed expression that people wear when they are trying very hard not to look worried. Zavaz himself looked older than I remembered, not by much, but enough. He greeted me with a formal Veth gesture, a slight bow with the hands held flat at the sides, and I returned it precisely. Not warmly, not coldly, professionally. We sat down. He spoke first, which I had expected. Zovaz had always been a man who preferred to control the opening of any conversation. The difference now was that his opening was not a declaration. It was a question. Ambassador Voss, he said, I would like to understand where we stand. I had planned for a long list of opening moves on his part. A question was not among them. I adjusted silently. That depends, I said, on what you would like to discuss. The council is experiencing difficulties, he said. The words came out measured, careful, like a man picking his way across uncertain ground. Several of them are directly related to the absence of human technical cooperation. I am here because I would like to explore whether some form of resumed collaboration is possible. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, almost humble. But I had spent 11 years learning to read the specific way Veth representative constructed sentences. The phrase some form of resumed collaboration was doing a lot of heavy lifting. It implied that we had been collaborating before, that our work had been a joint effort between equals. It skipped past the fact that our contributions had been largely unacknowledged, unpaid in many cases, and certainly never formally valued. Before we discuss resumed anything, I said, I think we should be clear about what actually happened. Would you object to me putting a document on the table? He gestured for me to proceed. Grant slid the folder across to me. I opened it and placed a single sheet in the center of the table. This is a summary, I said, of Earth's direct and indirect contributions to Council infrastructure over the past 40 years. It covers medical protocols, navigation systems, agricultural technology, translation architecture, materials science applications, and approximately 300 other categories. Each entry has been independently verified and assigned a current market value. Zovaz looked at the sheet. He looked at it for a long time. His aides did not look at it. They looked at him. The total at the bottom of the page had 12 digits. This is not a bill, I said before he could respond. We are not presenting this as a demand for payment. We are presenting it because I think it is important for this conversation that everyone in this room understands what the baseline is. For 40 years, Earth contributed this much to the shared infrastructure of this council and received in return a seat in the outer ring of the convocation hall and 3 tabled objections. Zovaz set the sheet down. Ambassador, I am not finished, I said, and my voice was still even, still calm, still entirely free of the anger that had lived in my chest for 3 years and had no interest in coming out in this room. I want to say this clearly, because I think clarity is more useful than posturing. Earth did not leave the Council as a strategy. We left because the alternative was to remain members of a body that had decided our role was to contribute without influence. We are not interested in that arrangement. We are not going to return to that arrangement. What we are willing to discuss is a new arrangement, one in which our participation is recognized, valued, and reflected in actual governance. Zovaz was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does that look like?" And for the first time in that meeting, I felt something shift. Not a victory, it was too early for that, but something real, an actual question, not a negotiating tactic. Not a power move, just a man asking what it would take. It looks like a permanent human seat on the Resource Allocation Committee, I said, with actual voting weight, not an advisory role. It looks like a formal framework for valuing and compensating technical contributions made by member species to shared infrastructure. It looks like a revised charter for the Karath Accords that doesn't lock smaller species into a tiered system they can never vote their way out of. The accords have already been ratified, he said. Then they can be amended, I said. Charters get amended. That is what amendment processes are for. One of his aides leaned forward and murmured something to him in Veth. Zovaz listened, then shook his head slightly. These are significant asks, he said. Yes, I agreed. They are. I would be concerned if they weren't. Owen, to my left, was doing an excellent job of keeping his face neutral. I had coached him on this. The impulse to show satisfaction or relief or any of the human tells that signal we care about the outcome. That impulse had to stay off the table. Not because we did not care, we cared enormously. But the moment you show how much you want something in a negotiation, you have handed the other side a lever. I will need to consult with the other major powers, Zovaz said. Of course, I said. Take whatever time you need. Earth is not in a hurry. That was not entirely true. We were in a hurry in the sense that the navigation grid's error margin was growing, and the Meridian Group was getting calls from 3 separate parties, and the Foreign Ministry was managing 12 separate bilateral conversations at once, and Alan Holt had not taken a day off in 2 months. But Zovaz did not need to know that. He gathered the sheet from the center of the table. I noticed he kept it, and we concluded the meeting with the same formal courtesy with which we had begun it. As he stood, he looked at me with an expression I did not have a clean name for. It was not quite respect. It was something in the vicinity of recognition. You handled this with considerable restraint, he said. After everything. We are a patient species, I said. He almost smiled. We did not think so initially. No, I said. Most people don't. After they left, Owen turned to me with both eyebrows raised. Grant was already typing notes. Carla was staring at the middle distance with the focused look of someone running calculations. That went better than I expected, Owen said. It went exactly as I expected, I said, because I expected them to come in here having already realized they need us more than we need them, but being too proud to say so directly, which means the actual negotiation starts now. The meeting today was just them deciding whether to take us seriously. And they took us seriously. He nodded slowly. The navigation grid briefing came in this morning, by the way. The error rate is up another 4%. Tell the Meridian Group to keep filing their availability notices with the infrastructure office, I said. Politely, monthly, as required by standard contractor protocol. He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. Outside the viewport, Titan Station turned slowly against the dark. Somewhere out there, the council was recalibrating. Zovaz was making calls. 14 people in Cape Town were drinking coffee and waiting as they had been waiting for months, with the particular patience of people who know exactly how much they are worth. We were not done. We were barely started. But for the first time in 11 years, the conversation was happening on ground that was actually level. And that, I had decided a long time ago, was all we had ever wanted. The negotiations took 4 months. I say negotiations because that is the polite technical word for what happened. The reality was more complicated than a single word can hold. There were days that felt like genuine progress. Zovaz and I sitting across a table and speaking with the kind of careful honesty that only becomes possible when both sides have stopped pretending the power dynamic is something other than what it is. And then there were days that felt like walking backward through wet sand, when one of the other major powers would introduce a new objection or a reframing of something we had already agreed upon, and we would have to start that particular thread from the beginning. Owen kept a running count of how many times the phrase, "in principle, we agree," was used to mean we do not agree at all, but we are not ready to say so. By the end of the second month, the number was 47. Grant Ellison, who had been practicing trade law for 22 years and had the temperament of a man who finds comfort in complexity, loved every minute of it. Carla Drew, who had once told me that she considered ambiguity to be a form of professional insult, did not. I moved between them the way I had always moved in difficult rooms. Steadily, without hurry, watching what was actually happening underneath the words. What was actually happening was this. The 6 major powers of the Galactic Council were coming to terms, at different speeds, and with varying degrees of grace, with the fact that they had made a significant error. Not a moral error, or at least they were not framing it in those terms, and I was not going to push them to. A practical error. They had structured their entire collaborative framework around contributions that they had not valued until those contributions disappeared. And now they needed to rebuild that framework in a way that would bring those contributions back without appearing to have been forced into it. That last part, the appearance, was what slowed everything down. Pride is a powerful brake. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Midway through the 3rd month, I received a request for a private meeting from the Ithori delegation. The Ithori were one of the smallest species represented on the council. Their home system had 4 inhabited worlds. Their total population was roughly the size of a mid-sized human nation, and in 40 years of council membership, they had never once been involved in a major political dispute. They were present, they voted, they contributed what they could, and they were generally ignored by the major powers in the way that quiet, reliable people are often ignored. Not with hostility, just with the particular blindness of those who only look up when something is on fire. Their senior delegate was a man named Avas, or that was the closest approximation of his name that my translation unit could produce in English. He met me in a small side room near the Titan Station cafeteria, with no aides, no formal setup, just 2 chairs and a window looking out at the rings of Saturn in the far distance. He said without preamble, we were not in crisis. After the withdrawal, when everything else started to come apart, we were not. I looked at him. I know, I said, I saw the reports. Do you know why? I had suspected. But I wanted to hear him say it. Because we had been watching you, he said, for years, quietly. We saw what you were doing, not the obvious things, not the published research or the formal agreements. The other things, the maintenance logs, the update patches, the translation corrections that no one requested, the background work that made everything else function. He paused. We were afraid that one day you would leave, so we started documenting everything we could access, everything we could verify. We built our own archive of human technical contributions because we thought if they ever go, we want to know how things actually work. I sat with that for a moment. Why were you afraid we would leave? I asked. Evis was quiet. Because we saw how they treated you, he said. And we know what it looks like when a species decides, finally, that patience has a limit. I thought about the 11 years I had spent in that convocation hall, the outer ring seat, the tabled objections, the small, constant erosion of being seen as useful but not equal. I had not let myself feel most of it in the moment. You cannot function in a negotiating environment if you are carrying raw feeling around with you like an open wound. You set it aside, you come back to it later, or you don't. The other major powers are going to push back on the allocation committee seat, Eva said. They will offer advisory status again. They will frame it as a compromise. I know. We will vote against any version of this agreement that does not include full voting membership on the committee, he said. For whatever that is worth. It was not worth much in pure numerical terms. The Ithori delegation had 1 vote. But that was not the point, and we both knew it. It's worth more than you think, I said. Back at the main table the following week, the advisory status offer came exactly as Eva's had predicted. It came from a Drain representative named Harith, smooth, experienced, the kind of negotiator who presents a lesser offer with such warmth that it can take a moment to register that you have just been asked to accept less. I let him finish. Then I said, we appreciate the consideration. We are not interested in an advisory role. It would give Earth a formal voice at the committee level, Harith said. We have a formal voice right now, I said. We have the voice of a sovereign world that you are all here talking to because things stopped working when we left. What we do not have and what we are asking for is a vote, an actual vote. Because a voice without a vote is not participation. It is performance. Grant beside me did not react. He had heard me say variations of that line 6 times in the preceding weeks. But Carla, across the table, shifted almost imperceptibly. The tiny adjustment of someone who has just heard a door open in a conversation that had been feeling very closed. The silence after I spoke was a different kind of silence than the ones I had experienced in this room before. It was not the silence of people deciding how to argue. It was the silence of people deciding whether to stop arguing. Zovaz, who had been listening from the far end of the table, cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said carefully, we could take a short recess. The recess lasted 2 hours. When they came back, Harith opened with a different offer, not advisory status. Actual membership on the allocation committee with a voting weight proportional to council contribution level, using a formula that Grant had actually proposed 6 weeks earlier and been told was not under consideration. We were not told why the formula was suddenly under consideration. We did not ask. There were still 4 more weeks of work after that. Specific language, amendment procedures, the rebuilding of the Kareth Accords into something that the smaller species could actually live with. Owen spent most of those weeks either on calls or staring at documents with the look of a man who has had too much coffee and not enough sleep. Grant and Carla became, in that month, among the most effective negotiating team I had ever worked with, reading each other's signals and adjusting without discussion. There was one moment in the final week when a Cathali representative tried to insert language that would have effectively let the major powers veto any committee vote on technical grounds. It was subtle. It was buried in subsection language. Carla found it at 11 at night, called me at 11:15, and by 7 the next morning, Grant had prepared a counter clause so precise that when it was presented, the Cathali representative simply withdrew the original language without argument. On the last day of the 4th month, the revised Kareth Accords sat on the table in final form. I read them through once, then again. Then I passed the document to Grant, who read them with the slow, methodical attention of a man who trusts no one's summary but his own. It's what we asked for, he said. Yes, I said. Is it enough? I thought about that. Not the legal question. The document was sound. I trusted Grant on that completely. But the larger question, was this enough? Was 4 months and 12 digits and Eva's in a side room and 40 years of quiet work finally having its accounting? Was this the right shape of enough? It's the beginning of enough, I said. He nodded, the way practical people nod when they recognize a practical truth. Owen knocked on the meeting room door and leaned in. They're ready when you are. I picked up the document and stood up. Then let's go finish it, I said. I had stood at that podium in the Grand Convocation Hall exactly once before, the day I resigned. Now I was standing at it again, and the hall was full, not with the usual distracted side conversation energy of a routine session, but with the particular kind of attention that falls over a room when everyone present understands that what is happening matters. 1,012 species, every seat filled. The translation units were all active, the soft, multilingual hum of the chamber running at full volume. I had written a long speech, then I had written a shorter one. Then, the night before, sitting in my Titan station room with a cup of tea and the revised accords and the view of Saturn's rings going slowly by, I had put both drafts aside and decided to say what was true. 11 months ago, I said, I stood in this hall and read a withdrawal declaration. I want to be clear about why I am standing here now, because I think clarity matters more than ceremony. The chamber was quiet in the way that very large spaces become quiet when they are paying attention. Not silence exactly, but a held breath. We are not returning because we missed this place. We are not returning because we were wrong to leave. We are returning because the work that needs to be done in this galaxy is too important to leave undone, and because the terms of that work have finally been corrected. I paused. Not for effect, because I needed a moment. For 40 years, humanity contributed to this council. We built systems. We maintained infrastructure. We developed protocols that are still running in 43 inhabited systems. We translated documents, patched code, wrote repair manuals, and showed up consistently, reliably, without being asked, because that is what membership in a shared community means to us. It means you do the work, not just when someone is watching, but especially when no one is watching. Zovas was in his usual seat. He was not leaning back. He was sitting forward slightly, the way I had not seen him sit in 11 years of watching him occupy that chair. What we could not accept, I said, was the idea that contribution without representation was the correct and permanent shape of our role here. We could not accept being useful but not equal, not because our feelings were hurt, but because it was wrong. It was structurally wrong. A body that draws on the work of its members and then denies those members meaningful governance is not a partnership. It is something else. We were not willing to be something else's resource. I looked out at the chamber. 1,012 species, and I was looking at the whole room, not at any one face. The revised Kareth Accords, which this council is about to ratify, correct several of those structural problems. They do not correct all of them. There is more work ahead, and I am not going to stand here and pretend that today is a destination when it is a step. But it is a real step. It represents a real change. And Earth is returning to this council on the strength of that change. I set my notes on the podium. I want to say one more thing, and I want to say it simply. The 11 months of our absence were hard for this council. I know that. I watched it happen, and I want to be direct. I am not glad that it was hard. I take no satisfaction in the difficulties that other species experienced. I am a human being, and human beings do not generally enjoy watching things break. There was something in the chamber at that moment that I did not have a precise word for. Not emotion, exactly. Something heavier, a kind of collective reckoning. But I am glad that the difficulty made the truth visible, because the truth was always there. It simply needed to be seen. I stepped back from the podium. The vote on the revised accords proceeded smoothly. 861 votes in favor, 19 against, a cluster of smaller powers who had benefited from the old tiered structure and were not happy about losing that advantage. 132 abstentions. Owen, sitting beside me, kept his face professionally still during the count. When the result was formally announced, he picked up his pen and made a small mark on the notepad in front of him. Not celebratory. Just the quiet notation of a man who keeps careful records. Zovas did not give a speech. He was the one who surprised me most that day. When the ratification was complete and the procedural session had closed, he made his way around the chamber perimeter to where the human delegation was gathering its materials. And he stopped in front of me, and he said, in a voice that was not projected to the room but directed only to me, "The acknowledgement will be entered into the formal record today. Earth's foundational contributions specifically enumerated. I wanted you to know before the session closes. It was not an apology. The Veth language does not have a direct equivalent for apology. In a formal context, they have a construct that is closer to recognition of an imbalance. But I had spent 11 years learning to understand the Veth, and what Zovas was doing, in his way, was as close as his culture's framework would allow him to get. Thank you, I said, and I meant it without irony, which surprised me a little. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded and moved on. I stood there for a moment with Owen at my shoulder, and the hall slowly emptying around us, the sound of 1,012 species resuming their separate conversations, heading toward the corridor doors, moving into the next part of their day. The translation units were cycling down. The light through the ceiling panels shifted as the session lights dimmed. I thought about Dr. Lena Marsh in her Edinburgh lab, who had never intended to become a galactic crisis point and had probably spent the last 11 months being mildly exasperated that everyone kept calling her office. I thought about the 14 people in Cape Town who had made themselves unavailable for comment for almost a year and had spent that time quietly consulting for private shipping companies at rates that I had been told were extremely reasonable. I thought about Avis, who had sat in a side room near a cafeteria and said, "We saw what you were doing," with the straightforward simplicity of someone stating an obvious fact. I thought about Owen, who had kicked himself for almost smiling at the wrong moment 11 months ago, and had spent every day since becoming someone I was proud to work beside. And I thought about 40 years. 40 years of people who had fixed things without being asked, who had written manuals in the middle of the night, who had patched systems and developed protocols and translated documents and shown up and kept showing up. Because that is simply what they did, who they were, how they understood their place in the universe. Not as passengers, never as passengers, but as crew. Not the loudest crew, not the oldest, not the most decorated or the most feared, but the kind that keeps the lights on. Spoke first. What happens now? Now, I said, we get to work. He almost smiled again. This time I let him. The lights in the grand convocation hall finished dimming. The great chamber settled into its between-session quiet. Outside on Vareth Prime, the amber sky was moving into late afternoon, the light going long and warm across the transit lines and the towers. Humanity was back at the table, not the outer ring, the table. And the galaxy, which had needed 11 months to learn to count what had always been there, was finally beginning to understand something that we had known about ourselves for a very long time. We were not remarkable because we were loud, or because we were ancient, or because we held the biggest piece of sky. We were remarkable because when something was broken, we fixed it. When something was missing, we built it. When someone needed a manual written in the middle of the night, we wrote it. And we did it not for recognition, not for power, not because anyone asked, but because the work mattered, and the work was ours, and the work was real. That is what it means to be human in the dark between the stars. You show up, you stay. You do the work that no one else is doing, in the silence where no one is watching, because the lights need to stay on, and someone has to care enough to make sure they do. We walked away once. We had needed to. But we were home now, and there was work to do. And we have never once, in our long and complicated history, walked away from work that needed doing. So we got started, and this time everyone knew our name.